James Thornton, thank you so much for agreeing to an interview for my book, A Restored Earth. How are you?
I'm great, and thanks, Edward. It's great to be meeting with you.
Thank you so much. Could you begin by describing Climate Earth, how it came about, what your cause is, and how it works?
Yes, well, the cause is trying to find a way to help humans and the rest of nature live comfortably together on the planet for the long term. So as you were walking in, I showed you just outside our office is a playground. The playground is full of children. They're often very happy children, and every time I walk past, I think those are our clients. Those are our clients. So a lot of what we do is to try and actually imagine a future world in which we do live with climate change having been at least damped down and biodiversity having been somewhat protected, because both of them are problems that we're not going to be able to bring back to the zero baseline, but we can improve what we're doing with it. And then we use law as a way of helping construct that society. Now, you asked how I got started, and I'll tell you more about how we try to imagine constructing that society and then do it. But I started in this in the United States a long time ago, in 1979, and I worked at a place there called the Natural Resources Defense Council. It's a big American group, and it used law for the environment right from the beginning. I got there in year 9, but they started in 1970. The year the Clean Air Act was passed, and around the same time the Clean Air, Clean Water Act and the what we call environmental assessments here, called environmental impact statements there, and the law that requires them. So these basic statutes passed around the same time. And then this group was founded, and it was a small group of lawyers. I got there in year 9. In year 9 it was around the same size as Klein Earth is now in year 9.5. So there were about 100 people. It had 3 offices, and it was doing a tremendous amount in terms of writing laws, implementing laws, enforcing laws, and strategizing about what society should look like if we were to solve these problems. So when I came here, I moved to the UK about 16, 17 years ago, and I just thought, there are all these big sophisticated European groups. I'll work as a lawyer for one of these groups. It'll be a lot of fun. And I looked around, and law wasn't being used by the environmental movement in the EU at all. I mean, UK, the rest of Europe, in the way it had been in the United States. So I went around, and as I do when I set things up, I've set up a number of things, like the Los Angeles office of NRDC. And by setting that up, learned how to bring together what you need to do in order to create an organization. So I went around and I talked to the heads of environmental organizations in the UK and in Brussels and in Warsaw. And you may ask me why Warsaw, if you wish. What I found was that while the groups were very professional and knew what they were doing, their primary tactic was campaigning. And that is great insofar as it goes, but I had come from the experience of campaigning and law both being used and being together very powerful, more powerful in each on its own. So I then discussed with people, well, wouldn't it be great if we had a legal capacity for the environmental movement throughout the EU that would be synergistic with campaigning, so that when campaigns were developed, you had a clear strategy that involved both politics and law, so that if you win politically and get a law that will improve things in a certain way, say about climate change, you then also know how to write the law, you then follow through and implement the law, and ultimately follow through and enforce the law. And that was the beginning of Klein Earth. 10, 11 years ago when I started talking to people about this, I worked with an academic to try and identify the number of lawyers working full-time inside environmental organizations in the UK and the EU in order to get a comparison, to see if my impressions were accurate. And in the United States at that point, he counted around 500 lawyers working inside environmental NGOs as full-time employees practicing law. And he was only able to find around 20 or so in all of the EU. And actually I knew many of those people, and many of them weren't practicing as lawyers. They were, say, an administrator or a general counsel who worked on the business of the organization. So there was a tremendous disparity in the amount of legal time, talent that was available to the environmental movement between the EU and the US, and that's what Climate was set out to address, really. And the idea is that, put very simply, how can I put it most simply? Between the powerful and the weak, only law can make up the difference. And the environment is always weak when it comes to corporate interests or governmental interests, and people demanding things are always weak compared to the companies who have platoons of very skillful lawyers. One of the first people I went to meet in Brussels was a guy who was then the head of the Environment Committee in Parliament, and we sat across from each other like you and I are. We each had an assistant with us, and he said, when I told him what I was going to do, "This is great news, I'll tell you why. I'm on your side, but I need help. I don't have lawyers to call on, and I have, when a bill comes up, I have BMW come in or some other company with 300 pages worth of amendments to the bill saying this is why it's good for BMW, this is why it's good for Germany, this is why it's good for the world. Here it is." And he said, on the other side, I have wonderful environmentalists who come in and say, let's make sure that you rewrite this to bring in the precautionary principle. And he said, but I don't get any actual help in writing the bill. So if you could take the desires of people who are trying to save the earth and turn them into law for me, I could then balance what BMW wants with what the environment wants. So he said, please, you're so needed. And that's what I discovered. We were very needed. There was not a single lawyer working for the environmental community in Brussels.
Amazing.
When I got there. Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. It really is.
So there was this big gap. It was astounding to me. So that's what I tried to fill. And one of the things I'm proud of is that we work with lots and lots and lots of environmental organizations all over the EU. It's I think we're unusual in that we not only work in coalitions, as all environmental groups do, but also we give our time to environmental organizations. If we're working on the same kind of strategic pathway, we'll often do free legal work for them, for dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations. And that helps them, empowers them, and ultimately teaches them how to, empowers them to do it on their own, which they then do. So that's the sort of niche, and the idea was that it was needed and that it would give power to the environmental movement. And then we can talk about some of the cool stuff we've done, if you like.
That would be great. Yes, thank you, James. So here you are in your wonderful office in Hackney in 2017 with a team of how many?
Well, in London it's about 60 people or so. Overall, 100 people.
Fantastic. Could we begin with climate change and your work on climate and the law? And how best to harness the law to address climate change, stranded assets, to promote renewable energy, etc.?
So here's one way you might think about it. As you will be very aware, the main problem that we're trying to deal with to prevent climate change from getting worse is our energy system, our global energy system. Burning fossil fuel is what got us there, and whether it's in in industrial boilers or in electricity generation or in vehicles, the burning fossil fuels is what gives us climate change. So we need to transform the energy system. Now, that's easier said than done. Lord Stearns estimated some months back that it required an investment of about $60 trillion over the next 15 years in building a clean energy system. And there are various ways you can imagine a clean energy system, but assume that you need to invest something like 60 trillion to build a clean energy system over the next 15 years. Governments can do quite a bit, but much of that investment will have to come from the private sector. So then how would you use law to try and encourage or in some cases push that investment? So the way we think about it is several components. One is you have to stop investment in fossil fuels. That's plank one. Now, that's not easy to do because the world has been set up to encourage investment in fossil fuels. It's not illegal to build a coal-fired power station, for example, yet building coal-fired power station is absolutely the worst thing you could do. We were talking about the future earlier. It's the worst thing you could do for the future. That's the worst thing you do to create climate change. So one of the things that we took on at the very beginning was to try and prevent any new coal-fired power stations from being built in Europe. And we, with a coalition of others, helped prevent a new generation of 6 coal-fired power stations in the UK, just when we were starting out. There was a coalition of groups working on it, and Greenpeace did a very successful campaign where they climbed smokestack and got people in the dock and a criminal case and got a lot of attention. We had a very quiet case going on in the background that was successful in helping convince the government to back off on this, which they did. Then one of the reasons for setting up a Polish office was to try and block all of the new coal-fired power stations that Poland was planning. They were looking to perfectly replicate the Soviet energy policies of the 1970s and build a succession of 14 coal-fired power stations, including the new largest one in Europe, which was going to burn lignite, the dirty coal, from the largest new lignite mine in the world. The British government actually saw a reason much more quickly. And in Poland, the idea was that coal is our national treasure. So, in a way, 40 years behind Western Europe in understanding environmental values. Not surprising, given there was Soviet domination for such a long time. But what we then had to do is to sue each of those 14 big investments to stop investment from going into the coal and fossil fuel, because each of those plants would then run 40 or 50 years. And with the many billions sunk in there, it wouldn't then get transferred over to clean energy, so that Poland would be sunk in a dirty energy future for the next, say, 40 or 50 years. Those suits have been very successful. Not easy to bring. We were denounced as enemies of the state by the Treasury Minister, and there's more of a story there to tell. Perhaps we'll have a beer or something.
Yeah, that would be done.
It wasn't easy. But 6 of those have now been withdrawn, and the other 8 are on hold.
Right.
So no new coal-fired power stations have been built. So that's, I was saying, that's the first thing you do, is to try and stop investment in bad stuff. Bad stuff here being fossil fuels. Then you try and make sure that the world is safe for renewables. And one of the ways we're looking at doing that is to, again back to fossil fuels, stop state subsidies from going to fossil fuels. Because states have been using subsidies to prop up fossil fuels and not to make the world safe for renewables. You really would like to see the renewables helped. Now, there have been some subsidy, but the majority of subsidies still go to fossil fuels. So how do you do that? Well, we've cooperated with a company which is challenging the plan of the UK to keep the lights on. There's a so-called capacity market mechanism, which every country has to come up with, which is a way of making sure the lights stay on, that there's enough energy in the system. And the UK used that opportunity to have a great deal of state subsidy go to fossil fuel as a way of keeping fossil fuel online. Now, that would be handy if there was no global warming. The problem is there is global warming. So we think that that was an illegal action, and we're cooperating with a company who has standing to challenge this in the European Court, which is happening. So you try and stop the plants, you try and stop investment from nation states from going into the fossil fuel industry. And then the other thing that we're doing to try and make the world safe for renewables is to try and integrate the European energy market. So if you want to build renewables in Norway or Spain, you want to be able to distribute it all through Europe, and you need to. Germany, for example, makes more renewable energy than it can use, and it often dumps it because it can't move it around the European system, because Europe is broken into kind of energy islands. The law requires the market to be integrated. Politics was all done, everyone agreed to integration, but the big energy companies are preventing it because they have monopolies, say EDF in France, and a couple of big ones in Germany, and they like the world the way it is. So we have a number of things we're working on to try and in that case, force the integration of the market. If you made the European energy system into an integrated one, as is required by law, then it would greatly encourage the development of renewables. You could build huge solar farms in Spain and send the electricity to Scotland and on, but you can't do that without that. So that's part 3. Part 4 is to go beyond. You're asking how to use the law. And a couple of years ago we said, well, we're doing what we can in terms of using environmental law, energy law, state aid law. How could we use laws that we're not using to prevent climate change? How could we go beyond the obvious laws? So we said, what about company and finance? We said, well, if we're going to move 60 trillion into investment in renewable energy, what are some of the barriers that we could look at in facing people who might want to invest, and then you're removing those barriers, or maybe should have to, and even aren't thinking about it. And then you can try and perhaps force them to invest, or at least think about investing. So we looked at company and finance law, and we said that, let's start a project to use these laws to remove barriers and to compel scrutiny of the duties of investors to look at climate change risk. So we now have a team of about 8 people doing this, and it's quite exciting in that we've been able to create the case, I think convincingly, that now from a legal perspective, climate change risk, which is undeniable to any reasonable person, scientifically, climate change risk is also financial risk. And it's financial risk to all classes of assets. I wrote a paper in Nature with 2 colleagues to try and establish that as a kind of a baseline of evidence. But it is climate change risk. And if it's climate change risk, it triggers a fiduciary duty of, say, pension fund managers, of officers and directors, of investment advisors, and indeed of actuaries, to see, well, what is the financial risk? It's quite clear that if the world will be deeply damaged by climate change, and crops will fail, migration will happen, water will become scarce, and so on. All of these do bring financial risk and bring instability in markets, and you can begin to quantify some of this. If that's true, what does it mean for me as a pension fund manager? What does it mean for me as an officer and director of a company with a lot of money to invest? And what we're doing there is to particularize and specify what the legal duties are. No one's done this yet. And if you just say it as I did in general terms, and you were a well-intentioned person, you might say, that's very interesting, I believe you. But what does it actually mean for me? And then it takes a lot of, essentially, imagination and study to say, well, so now we know that there is financial risk from climate change, but what does it mean for me as a pension fund manager or as an actuary? So we're spending time on deriving those duties in the terms of each profession within the investment chain, of every person in the investment chain who's a professional. And the basic notion there is that duties evolve over time. 100 years ago there was no climate change. So 100 years ago the fiduciary duties were quite clear, and there was no risk from climate change. Time has moved on. These are risks in the world that need to be picked up by the duties, and that's what we're working on. So we've worked with a barrister who's one of the top barristers in the UK on advising pension funds. And he is completely in agreement with us that there is a risk that's a financial risk due to climate change, and that pension fund managers need to take account of it. Now, what does that mean? Well, what it will mean once we get people to understand their duty is that back to all the money that needs to move in the direction of investment in clean energy, the pension funds in the UK, not only in the UK, have tremendous asset bases. And if they were to start moving in the direction of investment in a clean future, you would begin to derive the investment we're looking for. So we need to both remove the barriers to that, but also to push people to say you have the duty to examine it. Now, we can't say you need to, the legal hook isn't strong enough to say, and you need to disinvest in this and buy this. What it is clearly strong enough to say is, if you're running a pension fund, you must examine that risk and then take appropriate action. And that will change the mindset. It'll change the mind in the right way. A lot of this, all of this, everything we do is really about changing minds. You might think of environmental problems as mental problems. So, we have certain ways we do things. If those ways shift, then we can solve all our environmental problems. And using the law is then a very powerful way of forcing that shift. So, just to sum up on that, you try and move or stop investment from moving towards fossil fuel. From the private sector, you then stop public sector money, state aid, from going in. Then you try and make the world safe for renewables by, for example, making the EU energy market a single market. And then finally, you make officers, directors, heads of pension funds look at climate change risk and understand that they need to take it on. Oh, and by the way, the other thing we're doing is challenging, for example, annual reports which say business as usual is okay.
Thank you, James. Brilliant. I wanted to come back to cities later and air pollution, but before that, I wanted to ask you about a few other environmental issues which I'm hoping to cover. One is forests and how to protect and restore the world's forests. Another is biodiversity more generally, conservation. Another is fresh water and how better to protect it, reduce pollution, manage it more effectively and more sympathetically. And then one is on the marine environment, and of course the particular set of challenges facing the governance of the high seas and the ocean.
Yeah.
Does Climate Earth look at the sort of natural environment more broadly, and how then do we use the law for better environmental practice in those areas?
Well, that's a big question.
It is a big question.
But it's a big world, and these are big problems, aren't they, really? Yes is the answer. I mean, we try and look at things very broadly. With what is, after all, a limited set of resources. I mean, even with 100 people, that's a small troop of experts to deal with all of these problems. So, given the limited resources that we've got, which I hope increase over time, nevertheless, you can address many of these things, but you have to do it quite strategically. So, to take the example of oceans, when we were starting up, I had to say, what are the big problems that we want to address? And climate change obviously was one. It's really at the base of everything. Biodiversity was immediately behind because we are, I don't need to explain to you the biodiversity problems. We need to work on saving nature. And then other issues were, I separated out forests as a separate category to work on, although it's related both obviously to biodiversity and climate. And then human health, for example, toxic air pollution and access to justice, because it's much harder than it should be to get into the courts in the EU. That's another subject. But back to biodiversity then and marine as an example. So in looking at how we had to strategically deploy our resources at the very beginning when there were like 10 of us, I said we need to work on biodiversity, and we have even fewer resources then. What do? The common fisheries policy was just coming up for renewal at that point. So talking to scientists, which is what we always do, you start with the science, they said, well, the biggest biodiversity problem at the moment in Europe is fisheries, because if the common fisheries policy isn't reformed well, in 10 years, there will be the death of many of the fish stocks in European waters because we actually manage European waters worse than waters anywhere in the world. I said, okay, that's where we're going to concentrate. And we put together a small team of people who then worked on a common fisheries policy for, took about 6 years before it went through. And we worked with all of the other groups, and we worked with very closely with lawmakers in Parliament in Brussels, but also here, and we worked with fishermen, a lot of fishermen in the UK, but also elsewhere, to try and come up And this gives you a kind of insight into how we approach things. When you say, do we look broadly? What I want all of our projects to be doing is looking very holistically at solutions. So here we weren't looking to protect fish from people, or we weren't looking to give, as some of the companies were doing, as many fish to people as people could get. So we weren't either protecting fish or people. What we were looking to do is to protect the fish-people system. So looking at it as one system that has been around for a long time, and could be around for a very long time if properly managed. So how do you protect the fish-people system? So there are fishermen in 100 years and fish in 100 years, and that was the goal. And we became then very deeply involved in studying the science, and hired a couple of fisheries scientists to work with us, who are still on staff, because you really need to understand the science in all of these areas, but biodiversity brings it up very clearly. And I discovered that we don't have as much scientific data about fisheries as scientists would like, so you really need to understand the science we have. So understanding the science, we then concentrated on a number of provisions in the Common Fisheries Policy, including the definition of how many fish you could take. Because what it all comes down to is, if you leave enough fish in the sea, there will be enough fish in the sea.
Amazing that, yeah.
Amazing. People had sort of lost sight of that. And so we worked very hard on the definition of what's called maximum sustainable yield. But it's the definition of how to figure out how many fish to leave in the sea. And we had a big hand in writing that. And then, as always, what happens is the law passes and you enter an implementation phase. And this is true of this law, but of all laws. And one of the things I learned by talking to environmentalists when I was setting up Client Earth was that the environmental groups in the EU didn't concentrate on implementing laws or enforcing laws. And the head of WWF, who founded the Brussels office, Tony Long, the head of that office, identified that to me as one of the things that we could work on when I first met him. He said, if you could help with the implementation of laws, because you're lawyers, that would be great, because that isn't something that this community of environmental organizations does. So now we're working on implementing the Common Fisheries Policy, because in the implementation of laws, as you will know, things either go one way or another. So laws aren't self-executing, and there are always interested industry groups who would like to move the interpretation of the law in one direction, and that's generally the direction away from environmental protection. So you have Spanish fishing fleets, for example, who now want to take more fish out of the sea, and they will always want that. So then you have to implement the law to make sure you leave enough fish in the sea. This is one really clear example, but it's, again, one of the unique things that we do at Client Earth is to work on carefully on implementation. So that's fisheries. Now, fisheries isn't all of oceans, and at the moment we're studying what we might be able to do about toxics in the, like for example, toxic plastic pollution in the oceans. And you may have seen that last week the Mariana Trench, the deepest place on Earth, they just did a study and found it incredibly polluted.
It's terrible.
Unbelievably polluted. So toxics and plastics in the ocean. We're not active in that area yet, but it's something that we're studying.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Another issue that we're all following at the moment is air pollution, both here in London but also around the world.
Yeah.
And I understand that Client Earth are involved in some of the London work in this area, but perhaps in other cities. And could we go into how the law could address that one too?
Sure.
Thank you, Jamie.
Yes, we've been working on air pollution here from really the beginning of Client Earth. And when I moved to London, I started noticing that it was more difficult to breathe.
Right.
And I grew up in the United States, and and I worked a long time in Los Angeles. LA is famous for having dirty air, but it's much cleaner than London's. Because they've been working on it for a very long time. And that personal experience is one that a lot of people have. Many people, when they walk around central London, actually can feel it. You can feel it for a good reason. It really is not good for you. And that's the NO2, the nitrous oxide pollution, and also particulates. And it's true not just in London, but in cities throughout the EU. So when you look at a map of air pollution, you'll see that there are most of the big cities are violating the applicable standards. I just looked at this a couple of days ago for London, and for the NO2, we're actually, though, second worst. The UK as a whole is second worst to Italy. So we're particularly bad in that one. And NO2 is a problem. Traditionally we had pea soup fogs here. We don't have them anymore. That's fine particles that came from burning coal. NO2 though is a toxic, is a poisonous, invisible gas, which recent science has now proven causes strokes and heart attacks, and causes children who are exposed to too much of it to never have their lungs reach full capacity. So maybe a third smaller than they would be, which leads to problems later in life. So it's a genuine problem. And it's a problem here, but in these other cities as well. The reason for that is that Europe made the mistake of falling in love with diesel vehicle transport, and it was an unfortunate love affair.
It was, yes.
Because it's led to all of these problems. And in America, petrol is used, and so it's got much better air. New York, much better air than London, and that's largely the cause. And we've been moving in the UK more in that direction. I don't know, as you may have to go 2 decades back now, I'd have to check. But we had about 10% of the cars were diesel, and now it's about half. We've been moving in the wrong direction. So that's the problem is the diesel, and the impacts are 40,000 early deaths a year in the UK, according to the government, and over 400 in the EU, 400,000 early deaths in the EU, according to the EU. So what can you do about that? Well, this is an example where you can use the law very effectively. Some of the other things we were talking about are, when we were talking about climate change, stopping coal-fired power stations, that is a good legal lever if they're violating environmental laws.
Yeah.
Some of the other things we're talking about are very creative and new and on the edge, helping to frame legal duties. But air pollution is really squarely one of those things that if you're in violation, you're in violation. So when I was starting Clean Earth, I was looking for an example of a type of case where we could prove, or try to prove, that citizen groups, like Clean Earth or any other group of citizens, could enforce laws. One of the traditional complaints about European environmental law from scholars, from everybody, is that although the laws are pretty good, they're not very well enforced. And they have a scholarly term for that, which is the enforcement deficit. Anyway, what I thought was, citizens can do something about this. Maybe. Let's experiment. So to experiment, what I wanted to do is to take a genuine environmental problem, and as we've just seen, air pollution really is. I mean, it's not a hypothetical. It's kills people, harms children, kills people, and I wanted a law that dealt with a real problem, of which that's one, and a law that I thought would be enforceable, if anything, would be, because enforcement really wasn't very much done in the EU by citizens. So the air quality law has very good enforceability, I thought, because it has numerical standards for pollutants. So if you're the DEFRA minister, you know that you have to deliver air in the country with a certain level of this toxic pollutant, NO2, and a certain level of particulates, which are also very toxic. And there's a measuring regime which is done, and you can tell, are you delivering, are you not delivering, and there are timelines. In the case of NO2, 2010 for compliance. So I wanted a law, again, that was something to do with something that's very important and would be enforceable before we went to court. So in 2010, when the government was clearly in violation of the NO2, we wrote a very nice letter saying, what are your plans to come into compliance? Surely you intend to protect the health of the citizens. 48,000 of whom are dying, according to you, early each year. They wrote back and said, we have no intention of complying with law. until at least 2025, which is 15 years in. I mean, and when you say we're not going to comply for 15 years, that may as well be for 40 years or 60 years, really. And there was no excuse. It was just, it seemed to be inconvenient, you know. So we had to go to court, and we lost in the trial court, so-called high court, because the judge incorrectly said, "Oh, this looks rather like a European law. I'm a British judge." The way law works, while we're in the EU anyway, is that Britain and everybody else go to Brussels. They agree on the law unanimously, and then the law comes back and Parliament passes it and integrates it into the law of the country, whether it's the UK or France or whoever. So it's there sitting in the body of English law that the judge has to enforce. Anyway, he didn't understand that, so he said no. Then goes to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals judge said, well, no, it really is something I have to enforce. The problem is it's rather vague. Now, you'll remember I just said it's the least vague law I could find. You know, numerical standards, data, timelines. So we went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, at that point only 4 years old in the UK, because it's a new institution, very important new institution, said, we'll hear the case. The government stood up and said, Kleinroth is absolutely right. The first thing is, Kleinroth is absolutely right. You know, we're in violation. We did have to comply in 2010. We didn't. We have no intention of complying until at least 2025. And you, the Supreme Court, may not order us to do so. So I thought, interesting moment of constitutional crisis. Government refuses to obey law and tells court it can't tell them to do it. And in the UK, there's this legal fiction that the sovereign can do no wrong. So hence the government can do no wrong. Hence there isn't a tradition, of course, ordering the government to comply with the law. Instead, the courts tended to declare what the law is, assuming that the government was well-intentioned and would do it. But here, when you see the government is flagrantly in violation and has no intention of complying, it becomes a problem. So they stood up and said, you may not tell us what to do. And the Supreme Court, Lord Carnworth, turned to us and said, what do you want us to do? The government is saying it's not going to comply with the law, and we're only the Supreme Court. And we said, well, roughly we said, forget this is a matter of environmental law. You know, this could be family law or securities law or government procurement law. If the government can come in and say, we'll only comply with the law when it feels good to us, you're not a democracy under the rule of law. You're a government by fiat and dictate. And the Supreme Court more or less said, well, now that you put it that way. And they gave us an injunction. And it was only the first time in an environmental case, it was the first time in an environmental case an injunction had ever been given, which was a great step forward. And the government were ordered what to do. They were told to come up with a plan that would be finished by December of 2015, and that would bring the country into compliance as soon as possible. They had the nerve to, although they completed the plan on time, say, we've thought about it as soon as possible, and that's exactly what we said it was, 2015. So we had to go back to court, which we did, and got a very good judgment in November from Lord Justice Carnum in the High Court, who found the plan that they came out with entirely inadequate, and found that their modelling was based on, to put it kindly, very positive assumptions. I mean, really, really unrealistic modelling. And he told them to go back and do it again. So the stage we're at now is they have until April to come back with a plan that really will come into compliance in the next couple of years. And the court, very unusual but important here, because they were behaving badly, has kept jurisdiction over the case, so that they come out with a plan in April. It's finalized in July, and we can go back to court. I would be surprised if we don't have to, given their past conduct, after their plan is issued, to again challenge it without starting a new case, saying this doesn't meet the terms of the Supreme Court's order and the High Court's last order. So that's a long story, but it's it illustrates what you have to get into if you're trying to enforce law in countries, even with a very sophisticated legal system, as the UK, can have a more sophisticated legal system, but it hasn't done this before. So what I didn't expect in coming to a European country was to have to begin to set up all of this system so that citizens can enforce the law. Because ultimately, I don't want to be the only one enforcing the law. I want local citizens or national groups, or I want you, although it's hard for an individual, to be able to enforce the law. So to actually make the system work for all NGOs. Now, you asked about other countries. As soon as we won here, since the map does indicate that there are big red spots over lots of other cities, we brought now 10 cases in Germany. 4 of them have already been concluded favorably, and there's an appeal up to the German Supreme Court. We're getting very positive judgments out of the German courts. They also don't give injunctions. It's a new thing for them, but they've been very creative and progressive in giving injunctions because they see it as an emergency health situation, which it is. So they're considering things like ordering diesel off the streets in central parts of cities. Very interesting. So they're really taking it seriously. So that's Germany. We brought a case in Belgium for Brussels because we thought we should not only clean up Brussels but make the point.
It's at the heart of the Commission.
If the EU is sitting in Brussels and all legislators are breathing air that will potentially shorten their life, we may as well both make the point and clean up the air. And we're bringing the first of a series of cases in Italy, and then we'll do it around because the air all needs to be cleaned up. But what you're doing is several things simultaneously. You're demonstrating that citizens can enforce the law. You're creating a regime in which countries realize that they need to comply with the law, so that if the EU doesn't sue them, they thought they were off the hook. Now they realize the citizens can actually compel them to comply with the law. And the third thing you're getting is climate benefits, because in many of these cases you're also generating profound climate benefits. Now that'll be particularly true in Eastern Europe, because there are, in addition to diesel cars, a lot of pollution is coming from coal-fired power stations, which are emitting much more than their permits allow. So that's kind of an overview of the clean air work.
Thank you very much, James. And in listening to you across these issues, I feel one question I have is, is there any limit to this? Because it seems to me that this is such a vital means of putting the world on a better track. We need it to be sort of replicated at scale, fast across the world. And what's your vision of the role that the law could play in the next 10, 15, 20, 50 years in putting the world on a more sustainable track? And what's happening in China and India and in also some of the least developed countries where institutions are weaker? How could this go to scale effectively?
Well, you're right to suppose that I think it would be useful everywhere. And my methods really work in a country where there is rule of law. I mean, a couple of people have said, could you solve the environmental problems of Russia? Or of the Republic of Congo. If in a country which is a failed state or a police state, it's very difficult for citizens to do anything, even using law, if a government won't respect law. We haven't gotten to that stage, happily, yet in the EU or the United States, and I hope despite the recent election there, that doesn't happen. But wherever the rule of law does work, or where it can be built, then you can use these tools. So we're working on helping to increase the rule of law I should say that everything we've been doing in the EU is also building the rule of law, so that when governments know that they'll be accountable, that's helping to build the rule of law. But more directly, in the African countries we're working with and in China, working very much on building the rule of law for the environment. And in Africa, we're working in 5 countries, and that's on forestry issues. And we can go back to that if you like.
Yes, that'd be great.
In China, the work is, to me, fascinating. So I got invited in September of 2014 to Beijing to give a seminar to some members of the Chinese Supreme Court and then senior people at the Environment Ministry and from the Congress on a new law they had just passed and how to make it work. And get this, here's the new law. It's called the Environmental Protection Law, 2015, and it gives Chinese environmental NGOs the right to sue polluting companies. Now that's pretty good. This is a new right in China, and what you may not be aware is you don't have that right in the UK. But you, no, I mean the Environment Agency does it, and they do a pretty decent job. It wouldn't be bad if we had the right. It's odd that we don't. But in China, this is it's a fantastic change, to give citizens this much power. And I actually, after my seminar, I was discussing it with the judges, and I said, this is really a revolution, and they said, why don't we say it's a sea change? They have a wonderful sense of humor, but it is a very important change in a kind of shift of power, and they did it very consciously by studying how environmental law is enforced in the West, and they came to the conclusion, studying in part my work and the work of the people at Klein Earth, but also in the US groups like NRDC and Earth Justice and so on, that citizens played, or at least could play, a vital role in making sure environmental laws were enforced. So when I gave this seminar, and they said, you're the only person we know who's done this both in Europe and the United States, so from the perspectives of all of these different legal systems you work in, look at ours, and how do we make this law actually work in practice? Because having passed the law, we, the Supreme Court, now have the duty of writing the rules of practice, to actually give detail to how you bring the cases and how it all works if you're a citizen group. So I said, well, there are 6 things you need to do. Let's discuss them. And really crucial is that you allow the Chinese NGO, when it brings a case and wins, to get all of their costs and fees back from the defendant. Because after all, it's been doing a public service. It's bringing a case on behalf of all the people, and if the defendant is found guilty by the court, they should pay for the cost of having been taken to court, which is the American rule, and that it would be the rule here as well in the UK. But I said then you need to also protect them if they lose. In the UK, you pay costs. If you lose, it means that citizens can't bring cases generally. The American rule on environmental cases is that if you bring a case and win, you're compensated, and if you bring a case and lose, you pay nothing to the other side because, again, you've tried to do a public service. And happily, they saw the value of that, so that is now part of the Chinese system. And then about 100 cases have now been brought.
Really? Gosh.
Already, which is remarkable given that compared to Europe or the US, environmental NGOs are few and young and underfunded. I mean, it's a new thing there. So it's a very, very plucky people to have gotten 100 cases going. I mean, that's remarkable. I mean, that's more than I expect. If you take the cases that Klein Earth has done out of the mix, that's almost certainly more cases than all European NGOs brought during the same time period. Yes. I would guess. You would have to look, but it would be my guess. Yeah. So I'm just emphasizing quite a lot of work these guys have done. And last I was told, something like half of them have been decided, and I think all but one favorably to the plaintiffs. Amazing. Which is remarkable. So the higher level picture here is that by going to China, by talking to senior officials, it's become very clear to me that they're incredibly serious about cleaning up the environment. And they know they need to do it. They know they need to do it the way they describe it is the people are suffering, the economy is suffering. We have a very long-term view in China, and our civilization is 2,500 years old. We expect it to be here 2,500 years from now, but it won't be. If pollution continues at the same level, we'll destroy the soil, we'll destroy the water, it won't be here. So we have a tremendous self-interest in cleaning up, and people are so upset by it that political instability will result in the near term if we don't clean up the environment. So the government has a series of reasons to take it seriously, and it goes all the way to the top. So seriously do they take it that they have come up with a plan for what they call ecological civilization. And when you talk to the senior officials about it, and inquire about what it is and how serious they are about it, they're dead serious about it. And what they say is, here's what it means. There was the agricultural civilization, there was the industrial civilization, and now if humanity is going to survive and prosper, there needs to be an ecological civilization. We want to figure out what that means. So they've broken that down into 8 components, and they have hundreds of their best intellectuals working on how to imagine and then move towards an ecological civilization. So they're looking at agriculture, they're looking at resource policies, they're looking at economics, they're looking at industrial policy for an ecological future. Remarkable. I mean, how different from what's going on in London or Washington or Brussels, for that matter. You know, it's an incredibly enlightened view. Now, what they hope is that they'll figure it out, that then they'll figure out a transition path to get there. And then they want to demonstrate that it's successful, so they can export these ideas.
Thank you. Gosh,
remarkable.
It is a remarkable prospect.
And we're helping. So
they
they put me on a panel that reports to the Premier on rule of law for ecological civilization.
Wonderful.
To again imagine how law would have to change in order to help deliver this.
Thank you, James. I wanted to ask you, and I'm conscious I mustn't be greedy with your time.
Oh, that's good.
About the forest work, but also about your philosophy and your Buddhist practice and how this relates. And I also wanted to ask about sort of the history and the philosophy of law, and whether it's intrinsically environmentally minded or whether that's an evolving concept within the law. And I suppose, in summary, your vision for the future, because the book isn't trying to be optimistic about, the planet we might yet bequeath to our children and to the species which we share the planet, sort of to bring it all together around your theory of change for the next for the coming decades and your plans for the next stage.
Sure, great. Briefly then, forestry. So we started doing work in Africa on forestry, working with DFID, the British Overseas Aid Agency. And what I like about the cooperation with DFID is they actually see what we're doing as part of their foreign aid work.
That's good.
So not just in an environmental box, but actually part of the integrated vision of how to help developing countries, and I like that way of thinking about it. And what we've been doing there for 4 years is we started with Ghana, Gabon, and Republic of Congo, and then Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire more recently. So those 5. And the reason we've picked those 5 is that they export timber to the EU, all of them, and they've entered into or are in the process at some stage of entering into agreements with the EU on how to get access to the market, which is now required by a law that we and many others helped write on making sure that the timber that came into the EU market was legally harvested. So these voluntary agreements offer a terrific opportunity in that they have a series of appendices which say essentially that you, if you're going to enter into this agreement, need to work with your own people in a certain way who are dependent on forests. So forest-dependent communities get more of a right to participate in decision-making and, in theory, share benefits from legally harvested timber. That's the goal. So we started to work with groups of NGOs in each of these countries who are interested in this, and groups of lawyers who are interested in this, and working collaboratively to identify what the rights are that the communities have. And we got into, quite quickly, deep analyses with our African partners of what the land rights were, because very complicated land rights. I mean, we're used to land rights being relatively easy in Europe or the US, but there you have traditional land rights going back thousands of years. You have colonial land rights put on top of that. You have more modern regimes put on top of that. So it can be very difficult to figure out who has the right to what. And some of the traditional uses aren't respected by the modern laws, and so it all becomes quite complicated. So we've been working for years on that, and working to really build the capacity of our African partners, who have come remarkably forward in a short time, and now are awfully skilled at positioning themselves to help protect the rights of these communities. And indeed, we've gotten benefit sharing agreements. One in Gabon, which was the first time that the communities actually gain from the harvest of timber. There's much more to do. It's really just the beginning. And one of the things we're interested in doing is to try and understand how to help prevent conversion of primary forest for palm oil production, which is moving from Indonesia to Africa.
Yes, you're right.
So it's a very, very big problem. I'm working on some interesting ideas of how to use satellite information, big data, to work with companies who want to be responsible about that. Just beginning stages, but would be very, very interesting. So that's gives you a flavour of some of the Africa work.
Thank you.
And Buddhist practice, well, is what gets me through. Has for a long time. And if in a way, it's quite easy to become a Buddhist. You take a vow to save all sentient beings.
That's it. That's the rite of passage.
Basically.
Amazing.
So what does that mean? I mean, being a pragmatic sort of guy, I take it literally. So my job as an environmental lawyer is to help save all sentient beings. And I really mean save them, and so that means people and fish and insects and primary forest, and so how do you do that, and then everything we've been talking about in a way flows from that goal of trying to save all sentient beings. And it's a wonderful challenge, and it engages you very deeply if you see it that way. Then it becomes, it's not a game, and it's not just an intellectual puzzle, and it's not just thinking 60 chess moves ahead, which is what I need to do to win. Mostly we only win, so we're good at that. But it goes much deeper than that, and it connects one's life purpose then with using these, what in Buddhist terms are called skillful means.
Skillful means,
So law becomes a skillful means to help save all sentient beings.
Wonderful.
Good, isn't it?
It's a great thing.
Quite simple, really. And vision for the future. Well, you need to help me construct that, because I can't do it on my own.
It would be a great pleasure to do that.
I very much appreciate what you're doing in this book. It's
Thank
fantastic.
you, James.
And one of the things that might be interesting to you is I've been working on a book with my partner who's a writer.
Right.
Which is coming out in May from Scribe.
Oh, wonderful.
And it's called, Client Earth is all one word.
Yes.
And this book is called Client Earth, two separate words.
Oh, lovely. Okay.
And what we decided to do is to try and tell a story of a positive story, as you're doing.
Yes.
Of people who are accomplishing things.
Wonderful.
To save the planet and people.
Great.
And environmental books tend to, and I can see you've gone another direction, which is great. Environmental books tend to give you information and be depressing. Naomi Klein's book, she's a smart person, good writer on climate change, leads you down a series of, not to put her down, but it leads you down a series of blind alleys. Yes, I agree. And that's typical of environmental books, and you begin to feel kind of disempowered. So what we did, which sounds rather like what you're doing, is we have stories about trying to fight air pollution, trying to save forests, save fisheries, and in every case give an example in which people have succeeded in doing something positive.
Fantastic! I can't wait to read it. So it's published in May.
Coming out in May in the UK from Scribe.
Fantastic! Thank you.
I
would be so pleased to read it.
Yeah, absolutely. And
thank you.
It's. The idea really is that it's not that hard to figure out what we need to do.
Yeah, we just need to do it. Well, thank you so much,
Yeah.
James. Really, very much appreciated.
Edward, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Pleasure.